Dr. Ethan Montgomery strode through the halls of Boston Memorial Hospital with the confident air of someone who knew his worth. The youngest head of cardiothoracic surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital and heir to the Montgomery medical dynasty, Ethan had never wanted for anything in his life. His designer shoes clicked against the polished floor as he navigated the unfamiliar hospital where he'd been invited as a guest speaker for an international medical conference. "Dr. Montgomery, your presentation was brilliant," gushed a young resident who had materialized at his side. "The way you described your innovative approach to minimally invasive valve replacement was revolutionary." Ethan flashed his perfect white smile, the one that had graced the covers of both medical journals and society magazines. "Thank you. Innovation is in my blood," he said casually, as if groundbreaking surgical techniques were as natural to him as breathing. His two colleagues and longtime friends, Drs. James Hamilton and Marcus Fletcher, exchanged knowing glances. They had accompanied Ethan to Boston for the conference and were well acquainted with his effortless charm and the effect it had on people. "Save some admiration for the rest of us," James joked, as the resident hurried away with a flushed face. "I swear, Ethan, you could charm a statue into blushing." "It's a gift," Ethan replied with a shrug. "Can't help it if excellence attracts attention." As they walked toward the hospital cafeteria, Ethan's gaze was drawn to a woman sitting alone at a corner table, intently reviewing what appeared to be patient charts. Unlike the others who had been stealing glances at him all day, she hadn't even looked up when he entered the room. She was striking in an unconventional way, not the typical polished beauty he usually pursued. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore simple scrubs beneath her white coat. The name tag pinned to her pocket read, "Emma Sullivan, RN, Trauma Unit." "Earth to Ethan," Marcus waved a hand in front of his face. "You with us?" "Who's that?" Ethan asked, nodding toward Emma. James followed his gaze. "Emma Sullivan, head nurse in the Trauma Unit. Brilliant at what she does, but not exactly your type. Word is she turned down an offer from every major hospital on the East Coast to stay here, completely dedicated to her patients and this community. And completely immune to the Montgomery charm, apparently," Marcus added with a laugh. "I tried talking to her yesterday during the reception. She was polite, but made it clear she wasn't interested in socializing with the visiting surgeons." Something about the way Marcus said this stirred Ethan's competitive spirit. He wasn't used to being dismissed before he'd even had a chance to make an impression. "Not interested in the visiting surgeons, or not interested in you specifically?" Ethan asked with a raised eyebrow. "I'm telling you, she's different," James chimed in. "Rumor has it she's turned down the chief of surgery here multiple times. Not everyone is susceptible to status and wealth, my friend." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. In his world, there was no such thing as someone who couldn't be impressed by the right combination of charm, success, and the Montgomery name. "Everyone has a price," he said confidently. "Some just require more strategic investment than others." "Is that a challenge I hear?" Marcus asked, leaning forward with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Because I'd love to see the great Ethan Montgomery actually have to work for someone's attention for once." James checked his watch. "We're here for 10 more days. I bet you can't get her to fall for you by the time we leave." 10 days? Ethan scoffed, his competitive nature fully engaged now. "I could do it in 5. "Then it's settled," Marcus declared, extending his hand. 10 days to win over the unimpressible Emma Sullivan. If you succeed, James and I cover your tab at the Capitol Grill for our next 3 monthly dinners." "And if I fail?" Ethan asked, though the possibility seemed so remote he could barely entertain it. "You donate that vintage Aston Martin of yours to the hospital charity auction," James replied without missing a beat. Ethan whistled low. "High stakes. I like it." He shook both their hands firmly. "Gentlemen, prepare to pay up. I've never met a woman who could resist me for long, and Nurse Sullivan won't be the first." What Ethan didn't notice was the young resident who had been hovering nearby, hanging on every word of their conversation. Nor did he see her immediately make her way to Emma's table after they left. Emma Sullivan had built her life around 2 principles, honesty, and hard work. The daughter of a factory worker and a teacher from South Boston, she had worked her way through nursing school with multiple jobs and zero connections. Every achievement in her life had been earned through merit and determination, not family names or social connections. When her colleague Olivia slid into the seat across from her with an urgent expression, Emma barely looked up from her charts. "Whatever hospital gossip you're about to share, it can wait until I finish these notes, Liv." "Not, even if it directly involves you?" Olivia asked, her voice low but insistent. This made Emma pause. "What do you mean? That arrogant surgeon from New York, Dr. Montgomery? He just made a bet with his friends that he could get you to fall for him within 10 days. Emma's pen stopped moving. "Excuse me?" They were talking in the cafeteria. "I heard everything. He said, and I quote, 'Everyone has a price.'" Olivia's expression was a mixture of indignation and excitement. "The nerve, right? As if you're some challenge to be conquered." Emma slowly set down her pen, processing this information. She had heard of Ethan Montgomery, of course. His reputation as both a brilliant surgeon and a privileged playboy preceded him. She had deliberately avoided his presentation, finding his self-promotion in medical journals off-putting enough without having to witness it in person. "What are you going to do?" Olivia asked eagerly. Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then a slow smile spread across her face. Not the reaction Olivia had expected. "I'm going to teach Dr. Montgomery a lesson about making bets on people's emotions," she said calmly. "If he wants to play games, we'll play, but by my rules." "What does that mean?" Olivia leaned forward, intrigued. "It means," Emma explained, closing her patient files with deliberate care, "that if he's betting, he can make me fall for him. In 10 days, I'm betting I can make him surrender before the deadline. And in the process, maybe show him there's more to life than the privileged bubble he lives in." The plan formed in her mind with surprising clarity. If Ethan Montgomery thought she would be an easy conquest, he was in for a rude awakening. Unlike the socialites and fellow doctors he usually dated, Emma knew a different world, one of authentic connection, meaningful work, and genuine community, values that seemed foreign in his world of galas and inherited privilege. "Olivia, do you still have that list of hospital community outreach programs that need volunteers?" Emma asked, a strategic gleam in her eye. "Sure do." "Why?" "Because I think our visiting surgeon is about to discover his previously unknown passion for community service," Emma replied with a determined smile. "Let's see how the great Dr. Montgomery handles getting his hands dirty for a change." Little did Ethan know, as he confidently discussed dinner reservations at Boston's most exclusive restaurants with his friends, the woman he'd chosen as his next conquest was already 10 steps ahead of him, plotting a challenge that would test not just his charm, but the very foundation of who he thought he was. Ethan adjusted his custom Italian suit jacket as he approached the nurse's station. He had spent the morning researching Emma Sullivan, Harvard Nursing School graduate, recipient of the Distinguished Care Award 3 years running, and somehow still working at a hospital that couldn't possibly be paying her what she was worth. It didn't make sense to him, but he figured understanding her motivations might help his cause. "Excuse me," he said, flashing his most charming smile at the unit secretary. "I'm looking for Nurse Sullivan." "Dr. Montgomery," Emma's voice came from behind him. "I've been expecting you." Ethan turned, momentarily caught off guard by her directness. "You have?" Emma's expression was pleasant, but unimpressed. "Word? Travels fast in hospitals. I heard you were asking about me. I was hoping to invite you to dinner tonight." Ethan recovered smoothly. "I know a fantastic little place on Newbury Street, very exclusive, but I can get us in." Emma regarded him carefully, as if considering a particularly challenging patient case. "I appreciate the invitation, but I can't tonight. I'm volunteering at the South End Community Clinic." Ethan blinked. This wasn't the response he had anticipated. Women typically rearranged their schedules to accommodate his invitations. "Perhaps another night," he suggested. "Actually," Emma replied with a thoughtful expression, "if you're genuinely interested in getting to know me, you're welcome to join me at the clinic. We're always short on volunteers, especially those with medical training. Ethan hesitated. Community clinics weren't exactly his scene, but the challenge in her eyes was unmistakable, and he wasn't about to back down so easily. "I'd be happy to join you," he said, forcing enthusiasm into his voice. "What time?" 6 o'clock, wear something practical, it gets messy." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan to wonder what he'd just gotten himself into. That evening, Ethan pulled his rental Mercedes to a stop outside a weathered building in one of Boston's less affluent neighborhoods. The pristine, luxury vehicle looked distinctly out of place among the older, more modest cars lining the street. He checked his watch, 5:55 p.m. Despite his reluctance, punctuality was ingrained in him. Inside, the clinic was bustling with activity. Families filled the waiting area, some with young children, others with elderly relatives. The atmosphere was a far cry from the polished, hushed environment of private practices he was accustomed to. Emma spotted him from across the room and made her way over, now dressed in simple scrubs. Without the white coat and within this setting, she looked more in her element than she had at the hospital. "You came," she said, sounding genuinely surprised. "And right on time." "I always keep my commitments," Ethan replied, trying not to let his discomfort show. "Good. We're short-staffed tonight and I could use a hand with triage." She handed him a clipboard. "Nothing you can't handle, I'm sure, with your impressive credentials." The subtle challenge in her tone wasn't lost on him. The next 4 hours were unlike anything Ethan had experienced in his medical career. The patients came with ailments ranging from common colds to chronic conditions exacerbated by lack of consistent healthcare. There were no advanced diagnostic tools, no team of residents to dispatch for tests, and certainly no concierge service, bringing patients refreshments as they waited. What struck him most was the way Emma interacted with each person. She knew their names, asked about their families, and treated each one with the same level of care and attention he'd only seen reserved for VIP patients at his hospital. "Mrs. Rodriguez, how's that grandson of yours doing in college?" Emma asked, an elderly woman as she checked her blood pressure. "Oh, Emma, he's thriving. First in our family to go. He's studying engineering, you know." "I remember. You must be so proud." Ethan watched this exchange with curiosity. His own patient interactions were efficient and professional, but rarely personal. He knew the facts of their cases, not the fabric of their lives. By the time they finished the last patient, it was nearly 11 p.m. Ethan's feet ached in his Italian leather shoes, and his back was stiff from hunching over makeshift examination tables. "You're surprisingly good with patients," Emma commented as they walked out together. "They responded well to you." "I am a doctor," Ethan pointed out, slight defensiveness in his tone. Emma smiled. "Yes, but these aren't your usual patients, are they? No hedge fund managers or celebrities among them." "Medicine is medicine, regardless of who's receiving it," he replied, though her observation made him uncomfortable. It was true that his private practice catered to a very different demographic. "Is it?" she challenged gently. "Then why aren't more top surgeons like yourself working in communities like this one?" Ethan had no immediate answer. The truth was, he'd never considered it. His career path had been mapped out since childhood: elite education, prestigious residency, taking over his father's practice, and eventually the family's medical enterprises. Community medicine had never featured in that plan. "I still owe you dinner," he said, changing the subject. "Tomorrow night?" "I'm busy tomorrow too," Emma replied. "Hospital fundraiser planning committee." "Let me guess, you want me to join?" "That as well?" Ethan asked, half joking. "Actually, that's not a bad idea," she said with a mischievous glint in her eye. "We could use someone with connections to wealthy potential donors." Ethan found himself agreeing before he'd fully considered what he was getting into. As Emma declined his offer of a ride home and stepped toward the subway station, he realized she had completely controlled their interaction from the moment he approached her. The next day, James and Marcus cornered him during a break between conference sessions. "So, how's Operation Conquest going?" Marcus asked with a smirk. Ethan maintained his confident facade. "Right on schedule. We spent last evening together." "Really?" James leaned in. "Where did you take her?" "That French place you were talking about. Actually, we worked at a community clinic in Southend, Ethan admitted reluctantly. His friends exchanged surprised glances. You? At a community clinic? Marcus laughed. I'd have paid good money to see that. It's part of the strategy. Ethan defended himself, meeting her on her terms first, then moving to mine. And when is she meeting you on your terms? James asked. Soon, Ethan said vaguely, but with less certainty than he'd felt when they made the bet. That evening found Ethan in a conference room with Emma and several other hospital staff discussing the upcoming charity gala. When Emma had mentioned the fundraiser planning committee, he'd imagined a sophisticated event at a donor's mansion, not a fluorescent-lit room with coffee from the hospital cafeteria. Dr. Montgomery, the committee chair, addressed him. Emma says you might have some ideas for attracting major donors to our pediatric outreach program? Ethan cleared his throat. Yes, well, in New York we've had success with exclusive experiences, private concerts, chef's table dinners, that sort of thing. Our budget is approximately $0 for donor cultivation, someone pointed out. Right, Ethan faltered. Perhaps leveraging existing connections then. I could reach out to some colleagues who might be interested. As the meeting continued, Ethan found himself increasingly engaged, despite his initial reluctance. The pediatric outreach program, bringing specialized care to underserved children, was actually quite impressive in its scope and ambition. What they lacked in resources, they made up for in dedication and innovation. After the meeting, Emma walked with him to the parking garage. Thanks for coming, she said. Your suggestions were actually helpful. You sound surprised, Ethan noted. Maybe I am, she admitted. I half expected you to bail. Like I said, I keep my commitments. Even when they don't directly benefit you, she challenged. The jury's still out on whether this benefits me, he replied with a hint of his usual charm. Emma stopped walking and turned to face him directly. Why are you really here, Dr. Montgomery? What's your actual interest in me? In this hospital? In any of this? The directness of her question caught him off guard. For a moment he considered telling her the truth about the bet, but quickly dismissed the thought. I find you intriguing, he said instead. You're not like most people I meet. And what are most people like in your world? She asked. The question was simple but profound. In Ethan's experience, people generally fell into predictable categories. Those who wanted something from him, his money, his connections, his medical expertise, and those who wanted to be like him, with his lifestyle and status. Emma appeared to want neither. They're not like you, he finally answered. You seem completely unimpressed by things that usually matter to people. Because maybe those things don't actually matter that much, she suggested. At least not to me. As they reached his car, Emma surprised him again. There's a neighborhood block party in my community this Saturday night. Nothing fancy, just good food, local music, real people. Come if you want to continue this conversation. She handed him a simple flyer with an address in Dorchester, a neighborhood he'd only driven through on his way to somewhere else. I'll think about it, he said non-committally. Emma smiled knowingly. No, you won't. You'll either come because you're genuinely interested in stepping outside your comfort zone, or you won't because the idea terrifies you. There's no middle ground here, Ethan. It was the first time she'd used his first name, and the sound of it lingered as he watched her walk away. That night, Ethan found himself restless in his luxury hotel suite. The bet that had seemed so straightforward was becoming complicated. Emma wasn't playing by the rules he was accustomed to. She wasn't impressed by his credentials or wealth. She didn't giggle at his jokes or hang on his every word. Instead, she challenged him, questioned his assumptions, and seemed to see right through the carefully constructed image he presented to the world. 5 days had passed since the bet was made, and not only had he failed to make progress, but he found himself being pulled into her orbit instead of the other way around. The community clinic, the fundraising committee, and now a neighborhood block party. None of these featured in his usual seduction playbook. What troubled him most was the realization that he was actually considering going to Dorchester on Saturday night, not because of the bet, but because he was genuinely curious about the world Emma inhabited, a world so different from his own, and yet somehow increasingly compelling. Saturday evening arrived with Ethan still undecided about attending the block party. He'd already changed his outfit 3 times, an unprecedented occurrence for a man who typically dressed with effortless confidence. Nothing in his curated wardrobe seemed right for a neighborhood gathering in Dorchester. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. "Dinner at Menton tonight, chef's table, James got us in." The exclusive restaurant would normally be exactly where Ethan would spend his Saturday night. He typed a response, then hesitated. The thought of another evening of predictable luxury suddenly felt hollow. "Can't tonight. Prior commitment," he replied instead, finally settling on dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt, probably the most casual outfit he'd worn in public since medical school. Dorchester was a mosaic of Boston's diversity, historic. Triple-deckers nestled alongside newer developments, families who had lived there for generations, mixing with recent immigrants and young professionals. As Ethan parked his car, several blocks away, suddenly self-conscious about the Mercedes, he could already hear music and laughter carrying through the early evening air. The block had been transformed. Strings of lights crisscrossed overhead between buildings. Folding tables lined the street, laden with homemade dishes spanning culinary traditions from around the world. Children darted between groups of adults, their excitement palpable. A makeshift stage at one end featured a local band playing soulful jazz that blended with the multilingual conversations around him. Ethan stood at the edge of it all, feeling conspicuously out of place. "You came," Emma's voice came from behind him. He turned to find her looking different than he'd ever seen her, relaxed in a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "I did," he acknowledged, finding himself unexpectedly pleased by her obvious surprise. "I thought for sure you'd choose some 5-star restaurant instead," she admitted. "The night's still young. I could still escape to one," he joked, but without his usual arrogance. Emma laughed. "Not before you try Mrs. Patel's samosas. They're legendary." She led him through the crowd, greeting people as they went. Everyone seemed to know her. Elderly neighbors called out blessings, parents introduced their children, young adults high-fived her as they passed. Ethan watched in fascination as Emma navigated this community with an ease and authenticity he rarely witnessed in his own social circles. Emma Sullivan, an older woman with a thick Boston accent, enveloped her in a warm hug. "Who's this handsome stranger you've brought?" "Mrs. O'Malley, this is Dr. Ethan Montgomery. He's visiting from New York. Ethan, Mrs. O'Malley was my 3rd-grade teacher and now runs the neighborhood after-school program." "Just call me Ethan," he said, extending his hand, only to be pulled into an unexpected hug as well. "Any friend of Emma's is family here," Mrs. O'Malley declared. "Has she told you how she saved our program last year when the funding was cut? Organized a whole campaign, testified at City Hall, wouldn't take no for an answer." Emma shrugged modestly. "The kids needed a safe place. Anyone would have done the same." "But no one else did, dear, you did." Mrs. O'Malley patted her cheek affectionately before moving on to greet others. As the evening progressed, Ethan heard variation after variation of this same story. Emma advocating for elderly residents facing eviction, Emma organizing health screenings for the neighborhood, Emma tutoring first-generation college applicants. The woman he'd initially seen as simply a talented nurse was revealed to be the beating heart of this entire community. They filled plates with food from at least 6 different countries and found seats at a communal table where Ethan found himself, in conversation with a retired firefighter, a community college student, and a Dominican grandmother who insisted he take second helpings of her rice and beans. "So, New York doctor?" the firefighter addressed him. "How'd you meet our Emma?" Ethan caught Emma's eye across the table. "Professional admiration," he said carefully. "She's quite respected at the hospital." "That's our girl," the man said proudly. "First in her family to go to college, you know. Could have gone anywhere after graduation, but she came right back here where she's needed." "Why did you stay?" Ethan asked Emma when they were momentarily alone. "You could be working at any top hospital, probably for twice the salary." Emma considered the question thoughtfully. "Because here I'm not just treating patients, I'm caring for neighbors. There's a difference." She gestured around them. "This community gave me everything: support, education, purpose. How could I not give back?" The concept was foreign to Ethan, whose decisions had always been guided by prestige and advancement. Community obligation had never factored into his career choices. As darkness fell, the mood of the party shifted. The band transitioned to more upbeat music, and a dance area formed in the center of the street. Emma was pulled into the crowd by a group of young women, and Ethan watched as she danced with uninhibited joy. "She's something special, isn't she?" Ethan turned to find a man about his age standing beside him. The man extended his hand. "Michael Brennan. I grew up with Emma." "Ethan Montgomery," he replied, shaking Michael's hand. Something in the other man's expression suggested a deeper connection to Emma. "I know who you are," Michael said, his tone friendly but assessing. "Word travels fast around here, especially when it involves Emma. What's a hotshot New York surgeon really doing at a Dorchester block party?" Before Ethan could formulate a response, Emma appeared before them, slightly breathless from dancing. "Mike, you made it," she hugged him warmly. "I thought you were working tonight." Switched shifts. Couldn't miss the party. Michael's smile was intimate, confirming Ethan's suspicion. "Your friend and I were just getting acquainted." "Michael's a paramedic," Emma explained to Ethan. "We've been friends since we were kids." "More than friends. Once upon a time," Michael added with a pointed look at Ethan. An unexpected wave of jealousy caught Ethan off guard. He'd never experienced the emotion in the context of dating. If someone he was pursuing showed interest elsewhere, he simply moved on. But the thought of Emma with Michael bothered him in a way he couldn't easily dismiss. "Dance with me," Emma suddenly said to Ethan, extending her hand. "Unless you don't dance?" The challenge in her eyes was impossible to resist. "I'll have you know I took ballroom dancing lessons for years," he said, taking her hand. "This isn't exactly the waltz, Dr. Montgomery," she laughed as she led him into the crowd. She was right. The structured, formal dancing of his upbringing bore little resemblance to the free, joyful movement around him. At first, Ethan felt stiff and self-conscious, too aware of how he might appear to others. "Stop thinking so much," Emma said, reading his discomfort. "No one's judging you here." Gradually, Ethan relaxed into the music, letting the rhythm guide him. Emma was a natural dancer, and as they moved together, he found himself genuinely enjoying the moment, not performing or impressing, just experiencing pure, uncomplicated fun. Later, they escaped the energy of the dance area to a quieter spot near the edge of the party. Emma handed him a cold drink from a cooler. "You surprised me tonight," she admitted. "I honestly didn't think you'd come." "I surprised myself," Ethan replied honestly. "This isn't exactly my scene." "And what is your scene, Ethan?" "Exclusive. Clubs, charity galas where the tickets cost more than most people's rent, hospital board meetings where you discuss cutting services while increasing executive compensation." Her assessment stung, partly because it wasn't entirely inaccurate. "That's not fair," he defended himself. "My family's foundation has donated millions to healthcare causes." From a comfortable distance, Emma pointed out, "Have you ever actually spent time in the communities you claim to help? Do you know their names, their stories, what they really need, not what you think they need?" The question hit home. The truth was, Ethan's philanthropy had always been conducted through intermediaries, foundation directors, event planners, PR consultants. It was abstract, sanitized, and, he realized with uncomfortable clarity, designed to enhance the Montgomery reputation as much as to help others. "You think I'm shallow," he said quietly. Emma's expression softened. "I think you're a product of your environment, just like I am. The difference is I've seen both worlds, you've only seen one." Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of several children who clearly adored Emma. They begged her to come see the art project they'd created at the community table. She threw Ethan an apologetic glance as they pulled her away. Left alone with his thoughts, Ethan surveyed the scene around him. Everywhere he looked, he saw genuine connection. Neighbors laughing together, grandparents dancing with grandchildren, teenagers helping elderly residents to comfortable Seats, families sharing food across cultural boundaries. There was joy here, but also a tangible sense of mutual support and interdependence that was notably absent from his life in New York. "She's got you thinking, hasn't she?" Michael had reappeared, offering Ethan a bottle of local craft beer. Ethan accepted it with a nod of thanks. She has a way of doing that. That's Emma, always pushing people to be better versions of themselves. Michael took a swig of his beer. "So what's the deal with you two? Because I gotta tell you, you don't seem like her usual type." "And what is her usual type?" Ethan couldn't help asking. Michael gestured to himself with a self-deprecating smile. "Working class, community-minded, usually from the neighborhood." "Like you." "Like me," Michael confirmed. "We dated for years. Everyone thought we'd get married." "What happened?" Michael shrugged, but Ethan could see the residual hurt in his eyes. "Life, career demands, growing in different directions. She'll always be family to me, though, which is why I'm telling you this. Emma Sullivan is the real deal. If what you're feeling isn't, do her a favor and walk away now." The warning was delivered without hostility, but with the clear protectiveness of someone who deeply cared for Emma. It left Ethan unsettled as Michael clapped him on the shoulder and walked away. Across the street, Emma was kneeling beside a young girl, admiring a colorful drawing with exaggerated enthusiasm. Her genuine delight in the child's creation was evident, and something about the simple interaction moved Ethan in an unexpected way. 6 days into their 10-day timeline, and the bet that had once seemed so straightforward had become hopelessly complicated. He'd entered into it expecting a simple conquest, another notch in his belt of successful pursuits. Instead, he found himself questioning not just his approach to Emma, but his approach to life. As the night wore on and the party began to wind down, Ethan realized he hadn't checked his phone once, a first for him in as long as he could remember. He hadn't thought about the hospital in New York, or his family's expectations, or the social obligations that usually filled his calendar. For a few hours, he had simply existed in the moment, and it had been more fulfilling than he cared to admit. When Emma finally rejoined him, her eyes bright with the simple happiness of the evening, Ethan felt a shift within himself that both excited and terrified him. The bet was becoming irrelevant. Something much more significant was at stake. The conference was drawing to a close, and with it, the deadline for Ethan's bet was rapidly approaching. 3 days remained, yet winning the bet had somehow slipped to the bottom of his priorities. Over the past week, Emma had systematically dismantled his carefully constructed worldview, replacing it with uncomfortable questions he couldn't easily dismiss. Morning rounds at Boston Memorial found Ethan unusually distracted. Where once he would have been impatiently checking his watch, today he lingered, observing the hospital with new eyes. He noticed how the janitorial staff greeted patients by name, how nurses anticipated doctors' needs before they were voiced, how families huddled together in waiting rooms, sharing their collective strength. This was medicine as community, not just as profession, something his prestigious New York practice rarely achieved, despite its state-of-the-art technology and celebrated specialists. "Dr. Montgomery?" A hesitant voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find a young resident, the same one who had complimented his presentation a week earlier. "I was wondering if you might have time to discuss your approach to complex valve replacements in elderly patients. Your published methodology has informed my research, but I'd love to understand the nuances better." A week ago, Ethan would have politely declined or offered a cursory overview before moving on. Today, he found himself genuinely interested in the residents' questions. "I have an hour before my next commitment. Let's find somewhere to talk," he offered, surprising both himself and the resident. After a productive discussion that left the young doctor beaming with gratitude, Ethan made his way to the trauma unit. He'd texted Emma earlier, asking if they could meet for coffee during her break. Instead, he found chaos. A multi-vehicle accident had brought in several critical patients simultaneously, and the trauma bay was a flurry of coordinated emergency activity. Amid it all was Emma, calm and focused, directing the team with quiet authority. She spotted him at the entrance and gestured for him to stay back as she moved between patients, assessing conditions, delegating tasks, and providing hands-on care where needed. Without conscious decision, Ethan found himself stepping forward rather than back. "Where do you need help?" he asked a harried-looking staff member. Minutes later, he was gowned and gloved, working alongside the trauma team. His specialty might be cardiothoracic surgery, but he was a physician first, and the skills required in this moment were ones he'd mastered years ago, even if he rarely used them now in his more controlled surgical environment. Hours passed, in a blur of focused intensity. Ethan worked seamlessly with the trauma team, his prestigious title forgotten as he became simply another set of skilled hands in the collective effort to save lives. When the crisis finally stabilized and the last patient had been transferred to surgery or the ICU, he found himself exhausted but exhilarated in a way his routine surgeries rarely produced. "You were amazing in there," Emma said, appearing beside him as he removed his protective gear. "I didn't expect you to jump in like that." "Neither did I," Ethan admitted. "It's been years since I worked trauma. I forgot how immediate it is," Emma suggested. "How raw and real." "Exactly." He looked at her with newfound respect. "You do this every day." "It's where I belong," she said simply. "Some doctors need the controlled environment of scheduled surgeries. I need the unpredictability of trauma, never knowing what's coming. Through those doors, having to think on your feet, making split-second decisions that matter." They walked together to the staff lounge, both in need of coffee and a moment of quiet after the intensity of the past few hours. "Rain check on that coffee date?" Emma asked with a tired smile, pouring them both cups of the hospital's mediocre brew. "This counts," Ethan replied, accepting the steaming mug, gratefully. "Though I had planned something a bit more upscale." "Of course you did," she teased, but without malice. "Everything in your life is upscale, isn't it?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it hit Ethan harder than he expected. "Is that how you see me? Just some rich doctor who's never known anything but privilege?" Emma studied him thoughtfully. "That was my first impression," she admitted. "But you've surprised me this past week, jumping into volunteer work, attending a neighborhood block party, jumping into trauma cases that aren't even yours. There's more to you than the designer suits and famous last name." Her acknowledgement warmed him unexpectedly. "There was a time when I worked 36-hour shifts in the ER during my residency," he reflected. "Somehow along the way I got comfortable." "Success can do that," Emma nodded. "It's not a crime to be successful, Ethan. It's what you do with that success that matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus and James, who had been searching for Ethan. "There you are," Marcus exclaimed. "We've been texting you for hours." "Sorry," Ethan gestured to his scrubs. "There was a major trauma case. I helped out." His friends exchanged surprised glances. "You? In the trauma bay?" James looked skeptical. "Since when do you handle random emergency cases?" "Since today, apparently," Ethan replied with a shrug. Emma stood up. "I should get back to my unit. Thanks for your help today, Dr. Montgomery. It made a difference." She acknowledged his friends with a polite nod before leaving. As soon as she was gone, Marcus leaned forward eagerly. "So, the bet ends in 3 days. Where do things stand with Nurse Sullivan?" The question, which would have seemed perfectly normal a week ago, now made Ethan uncomfortable. "It's progressing," he said vaguely. "Details, Montgomery," James pressed. "Has she fallen for the famous charm yet, or is this going to cost you an Aston Martin?" Ethan hesitated, suddenly reluctant to discuss Emma as if she were merely a prize to be won. "It's complicated." Marcus's eyes widened with realization. "Oh no, don't tell me you're actually falling for her." "What?" "No," Ethan protested automatically. "I'm just taking a different approach. She's not like other women." "That's what they all say right before they fall hard," James said with a knowing smirk. "Remember Charlie Peterson from med school? Made a similar bet about that anthropology professor. Ended up proposing to her 6 months later." "I'm not Charlie Peterson," Ethan said firmly. "And this isn't like that." Prove it, Marcus challenged. Seal the deal tomorrow night at the closing gala. We've got one last evening in Boston, make it count. Either you win the bet or you lose your precious car. The gala, Ethan repeated, having nearly forgotten about the formal event that would conclude the medical conference. Right. We took the liberty of upgrading your ticket to a full table, James added. Invited some of Boston's finest to join us, including that pharmaceutical heiress who couldn't take her eyes off you during your presentation. Thought you might appreciate options in case Nurse Sullivan proves too challenging. Ethan forced a smile, though the idea of spending the evening with anyone other than Emma suddenly held no appeal. Thanks, he said, trying to sound appreciative. Later that evening, Ethan found himself outside the staff entrance of the hospital, waiting for Emma to finish her shift. When she emerged, she looked surprised to see him. Ethan, what are you doing here? I wanted to ask you something, he said, uncharacteristically nervous. The conference concludes with a gala tomorrow night. I'd like you to join me. Emma hesitated. A formal gala isn't really my scene. I know, Ethan acknowledged, just as the block party wasn't mine. But I went anyway and ended up having one of the most genuine experiences I've had in years. He took a step closer. I'm asking you to do the same, step out of your comfort zone. For me. The sincerity in his voice seemed to reach her. All right, she agreed after a moment, but I don't have anything appropriate to wear to a fancy medical gala. Leave that to me, Ethan said, relief evident in his smile. The next morning, a package arrived at Emma's apartment, a stunning yet tasteful evening gown in deep emerald that perfectly complemented her coloring, along with a note, no pressure. Just thought this might help. Looking forward to tonight. Ew. What Emma didn't know was that Ethan had spent hours the previous evening searching for the perfect dress, not the most expensive or the most revealing, but one that would make her feel confident and comfortable in an environment where she might otherwise feel out of place. He understood now what it felt like to be the outsider, and he wanted her first experience in his world to be positive. As Ethan dressed for the gala, in his hotel suite, his phone buzzed with a message from Emma. The dress is beautiful, thank you. See you tonight. The simple message brought a smile to his face that faded quickly when he received another text, this one from Marcus. Ready to collect on our bet, Montgomery? Car or conquest? Tonight's the night. The reminder of the bet that had started it all left a sour taste in his mouth. What had begun as a shallow challenge had evolved into something he hadn't anticipated. Emma wasn't just another woman to be charmed and forgotten. She had affected him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of one of Boston's historic hotels, transformed for the evening into a glittering showcase of wealth and influence. Medical luminaries mingled with hospital benefactors and pharmaceutical executives, all congratulating themselves on their contributions to healthcare while enjoying the finest champagne. Ethan stationed himself near the entrance, ignoring the curious glances of his colleagues as he waited for Emma. When she finally arrived, the sight of her momentarily took his breath away. The emerald dress complemented her natural beauty without overwhelming it, and she had arranged her hair in an elegant updo that revealed the graceful line of her neck. You look stunning, he said, offering his arm. You clean up pretty well. Yourself, Dr. Montgomery, she replied with a smile, though he could sense her nervousness. Ready to show me how the other half lives? They're just people, he assured her. Privileged people with oversized egos, but still just people. She laughed, relaxing slightly. When you put it that way. They entered the ballroom together, immediately drawing attention. Ethan was well known in these circles, and his choice of companion caused a ripple of curiosity through the crowd. He introduced Emma to several colleagues, proud of how articulate and knowledgeable she was on healthcare topics that many of the socialites present couldn't begin to discuss. Ethan, there you are. Marcus appeared, champagne in hand with James close behind, and Nurse Sullivan, lovely to see you again. Emma's smile remained polite, but Ethan noticed a slight stiffening in her posture. Doctors, she greeted them coolly. We were just discussing Ethan's return to New York. James said with a pointed look at his friend. "The hospital board is eager to have him back. Apparently there's talk of naming the new cardiac wing after the Montgomery family." "Is that so?" Emma looked at Ethan with an unreadable expression. "Nothing's been decided," Ethan said quickly. "I've been considering some changes." "Changes?" Marcus repeated incredulously. "Like what? Switching from Armani to Brioni?" Ethan felt Emma's gaze on him, assessing and thoughtful. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of a stunning blonde in a designer gown that left little to the imagination. "Ethan Montgomery," she purred, ignoring everyone else in the group. "I've been dying to meet you. I'm Vanessa Cartwright. My father's pharmaceutical company is sponsoring tonight's event." "Ms. Cartwright," Ethan acknowledged politely. "May I introduce Emma Sullivan, head trauma nurse at Boston Memorial." Vanessa barely glanced at Emma before returning her attention to Ethan. "Your presentation on minimally invasive techniques was fascinating. I'd love to discuss it further. Perhaps somewhere quieter?" The blatant invitation hung in the air. A week ago, Ethan might have accepted without hesitation. Vanessa was exactly the type of woman he typically pursued. Beautiful, connected from his world, but now the thought held no appeal. "Actually, Emma and I were just about to dance," he said, turning away from Vanessa to offer his hand to Emma. As he led Emma to the dance floor, he caught the shocked expressions of his friends and the fury in Vanessa's eyes. But none of that mattered as he took Emma in his arms and they began to move to the orchestra's music. The orchestra played a waltz, and to Emma's surprise, Ethan proved to be an exceptional dancer. Unlike the free-spirited dancing at the block party, this was structured and precise, yet somehow in his arms it felt just as natural. They moved together seamlessly, as if they'd been dancing partners for years rather than virtual strangers a week ago. "You weren't kidding about those ballroom dancing lessons," Emma commented as he guided her through a perfect turn. 12 years of mandatory instruction, Ethan confirmed with a wry smile. "My mother insisted. She said a Montgomery should always know how to conduct himself in polite society." "And does this qualify as polite society?" Emma asked, glancing around at the wealthy attendees, some of whom were watching them with undisguised curiosity. "By definition, yes. In reality," he leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "let's just say I've witnessed more genuine kindness in one night at your block party than in a decade of events like these." The honesty in his assessment warmed her. Over the past week, she had watched Ethan evolve from the arrogant surgeon who had first approached her to someone more reflective, more aware. Whether this change was temporary or lasting remained to be seen, but she couldn't deny its authenticity in this moment. As the music ended, Ethan reluctantly released her. "Would you like something to drink?" "I'd love some water," Emma replied. "All this sophistication is making me thirsty." He smiled at her gentle teasing. "I'll be right back." Ethan made his way to the bar, only to be intercepted by Marcus and James, who corralled him into a quiet corner. "What the hell are you doing?" Marcus demanded. "Vanessa Cartwright was practically throwing herself at you, and you walked away for a dance with the nurse." "Her name is Emma," Ethan said firmly, "and yes, I'd rather spend time with her than with someone who only sees me as a connection to be exploited." James studied him with growing concern. "This is worse than I thought. You've actually fallen for her." "So what if I have?" Ethan challenged. "Maybe I found someone who sees beyond the Montgomery name and fortune, someone who makes me want to be better." "Better?" Marcus scoffed. "What does that even mean? You're Ethan Montgomery. Your family practically owns half the medical establishments in New York. You don't need to be better." "That's exactly the problem," Ethan realized aloud. "I've never had to be better because nothing was ever expected of me beyond maintaining the status quo. Emma challenges me to think differently, to see beyond my bubble." "Listen to yourself," James said, shaking his head. "1 week with this woman and you're questioning your entire life. What's next? Giving up your practice to work in some community clinic. Moving to a Boston neighborhood most of your patients wouldn't drive through with the doors locked." The derision in his friend's voice sparked something in Ethan, not anger but clarity. "Would that be so terrible?" he asked quietly. To do work that actually matters to people who need it most? Marcus and James exchanged alarmed glances. "The bet ends tonight," Marcus reminded him. "Either you win and prove she's just like everyone else, susceptible to the Montgomery charm and wealth, or you lose and hand over the keys to your Aston Martin." "The bet," Ethan repeated, having almost forgotten its existence. "Right." "Speaking of which," James added, "I think your target is about to leave." Ethan turned to see Emma making her way toward the exit, her expression troubled. He moved to follow her, but was stopped by a firm hand on his arm. "Remember what's at stake," Marcus warned. Ethan pulled free. "I do now." He caught up with Emma just outside the ballroom. "Emma, wait! Where are you going?" She turned, her eyes reflecting hurt and disappointment. "Home? I shouldn't have come tonight." "Why? What happened?" Emma hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I overheard your friends talking, Ethan, about a bet involving me. Is it true? Was all of this, the volunteer work, the fundraising committee, even the block party, just part of some game to you?" The color drained from Ethan's face. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment of truth that could destroy whatever had been building between them. "It started that way," he admitted, seeing no point in denying what she already knew. "The day we met, they bet me I couldn't make you fall for me in 10 days. The confirmation of her suspicions visibly stung Emma. "And tonight's the deadline, isn't it? So what happens now? Do you claim victory or admit defeat?" "Emma, please listen," Ethan implored. "Yes, it started as a stupid, childish bet. But somewhere along the way, something changed. I changed. The bet became irrelevant." "Did it?" she challenged, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "Then why didn't you tell me about it? Why keep up the charade?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted, the truth finally breaking free. "Afraid you'd never believe that my feelings for you are real. Afraid you'd walk away before I had the chance to show you who I really am. Or who I could be." "And who is that, Ethan?" "The privileged surgeon playing tourist in my world. Because tomorrow you go back to New York, back to your perfect life, and all of this becomes just an interesting anecdote to share at your next dinner party." Her words cut deep because they touched on his own fears. What did happen tomorrow? Could what he felt for Emma survive beyond this bubble of time they'd shared in Boston? "What if I don't want to go back to that life?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "What if I've realized there might be something more meaningful waiting if I'm brave enough to reach for it?" Emma's expression softened slightly, but the wariness remained. "Pretty words, Ethan. But actions speak louder, and your actions started with a bet on my emotions." "You're right," he acknowledged, "and I can't change how this began, but I can choose how it ends." He took a deep breath. "The bet is off. I forfeit. Not because I couldn't win, but because winning ceased to matter." Before Emma could respond, they were interrupted by the appearance of Marcus and James, who had followed Ethan out of the ballroom. "Time's up, Montgomery," Marcus announced, oblivious to the tension between Ethan and Emma. "The bet ends now. So what's the verdict? Did the famous Montgomery charm work its magic, or are we taking possession of an Aston Martin?" Emma's gaze darted between Ethan and his friends, the hurt in her eyes deepening with each word. "There is no verdict," Ethan said firmly. "The bet is off." "That's not how this works," James protested. "You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Ethan interrupted. "The car is yours. I forfeit. But not because I failed, because this whole thing was wrong from the start." Marcus laughed, incredulously. "Are you serious? You're giving up a $200,000 car because you've got feelings for a nurse from Dorchester. Have you lost your mind?" Ethan's patience snapped. "What I've lost is my tolerance for the shallow, meaningless games we play. Emma was right about me, about all of us. We hide behind our wealth and status, pretending it makes us better than everyone else when the truth is, we've never had to develop the kind of character and compassion she shows every day." The shocked silence that followed his outburst was broken by the sound of Emma's heels as she turned and walked away. "Emma, wait!" Ethan called after her. "Let her go," Marcus advised. "There are a dozen women in that ballroom who would kill to be with Ethan Montgomery." "That's the problem," Ethan replied. "They want Ethan Montgomery, not me. Emma is the only person who's ever bothered to look beyond the name and see the man, and she found me wanting." Without another word to his friends, Ethan followed Emma into the night. He found her waiting for a taxi at the hotel entrance, arms wrapped around herself against the cool evening air. "Emma, please," he said, approaching cautiously. "Let me drive you home." "I think you've done enough," she replied, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Just hear me out," he pleaded. "After that, if you still want nothing to do with me, I'll respect your decision." After a moment of hesitation, she nodded curtly. The drive to Dorchester was silent and tense. Ethan parked outside her apartment building, but made no move to exit. The car, sensing she would reject any attempt to escort her to her door. "I owe you an apology," he began. "Not just for the bet, but for who I was when we met. Arrogant, entitled, blind to my own privilege. I thought I knew everything, but this past week has shown me how little I actually understood about life outside my bubble." Emma remained silent, but he could tell she was listening. "When I first approached you, it was because my ego couldn't handle the idea that someone might be immune to my charm and status. The bet was just a symptom of a much deeper problem. I've been living my entire life according to expectations set by others. My family's legacy, my social circle's standards, the unspoken rules of the world I inhabit." He turned in his seat to face her, though she kept her gaze forward. "Then I met you, and everything changed. You showed me a different way to live. With purpose, with genuine connection to community, with work that truly matters. You made me question everything I thought I knew about success and happiness." "So what now?" Emma finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "You go back to New York having learned a valuable life lesson at my expense." "No," Ethan said firmly. "Now I make a choice. The first real choice I've made in years that isn't dictated by the Montgomery legacy or expectations." This earned him a sideways glance from Emma. "And what choice is that?" "I've been offered a position at Boston Memorial," he revealed. "The chief of surgery approached me after my presentation last week. I declined initially because it seemed like a step down from my position in New York. But now..." "Now what?" Emma pressed. "Now I see it differently. This hospital serves a diverse community. It has challenges my hospital in New York doesn't face. There's meaningful work to be done here." He paused. "And there's you." Emma finally turned to face him fully. "You would give up your practice in New York, your family connections, your social status, for a job at Boston Memorial?" "Not just for a job," Ethan clarified. "For a chance to become the person I want to be, rather than the person I was expected to be. For the opportunity to do work that matters beyond adding to the Montgomery prestige. And yes, for a chance to see where this thing between us might lead." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and Emma's expression softened slightly. "How do I know this isn't just another grand gesture?" she asked. "You Montgomery men are known for your romantic gestures, after all." "You don't," Ethan admitted. "Words are easy. That's why I'm asking for the chance to show you with actions, day by day. I'm not expecting you to forgive me immediately or to pick up where we left off. I'm just asking for the opportunity to prove that what began as a bet has become the most important turning point of my life." Emma was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "I need time, Ethan. You've had a week to fall for me. I've had 10 minutes to process that it all started as a game." "I understand," he said, though the thought of her walking away caused a physical ache in his chest. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, if you'll let me." "I can't make any promises," she warned. "I'm not asking for promises," Ethan replied. "Just a chance." Emma nodded slowly, then opened the car door. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Emma," he said softly as she stepped out of the car. He watched her walk to her building, fighting the urge to follow. This had to be her choice, on her terms. He had done all he could for tonight. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood in the newly established community outreach office at Boston Memorial Hospital. Boxes of medical supplies lined the walls, and volunteer schedules covered the bulletin board. He had taken the position offered by the chief of surgery, with one condition: that he would split his time between surgical duties and developing a comprehensive community health program that would bring specialized care to underserved neighborhoods. His father had been appalled by his decision to leave New York. His colleagues had been baffled. Marcus and James hadn't spoken to him since the night of the gala, but for the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing work that truly mattered. The only piece missing was Emma. True to her word, she had taken time to process everything. They had passed each other occasionally in hospital corridors, exchanging polite but distant greetings. He had respected her space, focusing instead on proving through actions rather than words that his change was genuine. A knock on the office door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to find Emma standing in the doorway, dressed in her usual scrubs, a tentative smile on her face. "I heard about the pediatric clinic you're setting up in Dorchester," she said by way of greeting. "Mrs. O'Malley can't stop talking about it, says it's going to change lives in the neighborhood." "That's the goal," Ethan replied, his heart racing at the sight of her. "We're starting with weekly sessions, but hoping to expand to full-time once we secure additional funding." Emma stepped into the office, looking around with approval at the organized chaos of a project in development. "It's a good thing you're doing, Ethan." "I had a good teacher," he said simply. Their eyes met, and the connection that had been building between them before the revelation of the bet flickered back to life. "I hear there's a block party this weekend," Ethan ventured. "Something about celebrating the new clinic." "There is," Emma confirmed. "The neighborhood wants to show its appreciation." "Would it be okay if I attended?" he asked carefully. Not as Dr. Montgomery from New York, but as Ethan, the new guy trying to be a part of the community. Emma studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I think that would be more than okay." "And maybe," Ethan added, hope rising in his chest, "if you're willing, you could show me around. I'm still learning the neighborhood." "I'd like that," Emma replied softly. As she turned to leave, Ethan called after her. "Emma, thank you, not just for this, but for showing me a different way to live, for challenging me to be better." "You did the hard part yourself, Ethan," she said. "You chose to change. That counts for something." And in that moment, watching her walk away not in anger but with the promise of a new beginning, Ethan knew he had won something far more valuable than any bet. He had found his true north, his purpose, and possibly, if he continued to prove himself worthy, a love that would transform his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be obstacles, his family's expectations, the adjustment to a different lifestyle, the continuing need to prove his sincerity to Emma and to himself. But for the first time, Ethan Montgomery was looking forward to the challenge, because now he was living life on his own terms, guided by his own values rather than those imposed by his name and status. As he turned back to his work, planning a healthcare initiative that would bring specialized medical care to those who needed it most, Ethan reflected on how a bet made in arrogance had led to the most unexpected and precious win of all, the chance to become the man he was always meant to be. Film de Historia, dear listeners, we hope you've been touched by Ethan and Emma's journey, from a careless bet to genuine transformation. For more emotionally captivating stories like this one, we've created a special playlist that explores the complexity of relationships and personal growth. You'll find it by clicking to your left. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that challenge assumptions and celebrate the power of authentic connection. We can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Which moment in Ethan and Emma's story touched you the most? Your engagement fuels our passion to create more stories that move hearts and minds.